All right, let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Jennifer Core. I'm the Executive Director of the Tennessee Historical Society, and this is the first in our series of Tennessee 101, Part 2, The History of Tennessee Music. This programming is funded by the Tennessee Arts Commission and Humanities Tennessee, so we'd like to thank our sponsors. I'd like to introduce Dr. Langston Wilkins, who is co-convener of this series. Dr. Wilkins recently joined the faculty at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Before that, his time in Tennessee was spent at the Tennessee Arts Commission and Humanities Tennessee, and he is a fan and an expert on many modern forms of music. So Langston, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Happy to be back. Good to see you all. And for those out there I'm not seeing, good to see you virtually. I have the honor of introducing Dr. Sean Pitts, who is a founding director of Arts and Mary, who's also a community scholar, writer, and rural arts advocate in Selmer, Tennessee. Dr. Pitts has been active researching and writing about the traditional culture of his native West Tennessee for more than 20 years. In 2012, he received an award from the American Folklife Center of the Library of Congress to document and preserve an archive of traditional music from the region. And in 2019, he co-produced and wrote liner notes for the Bear Family Records release, Discovering Carl Perkins, Eastview, Tennessee, 1952 through 53. Dr. Pitts' writing has appeared in Southern Cultures, The Daily Yonder, and The Bitter Southerner, among other online and print periodicals. He has also served on the boards of the Tennessee Arts Commission, Humanities Tennessee, the Tennessee Folklore Society, and numerous other community and cultural development agencies. And in his spare time, he's in private chiropractic practice in Selmer. So I want to welcome my friend and one of my favorite folklorists, Sean Pitts.
Thank you, Langston. That's a generous introduction. I appreciate you. And it is good to be back. I'm glad to be back for this series as well. We had a great time last year, and I'm really looking forward to the lineup we have. And this evening is no exception. I met John, actually. There's a connection between the three of us. I met John actually for the first time when he was in Brownsville, Tennessee, and what he was doing in Brownsville. Among the many reasons to go to Brownsville, he was out there for a presentation, actually, that Dr. Wilkins and Dr. Bradley Hanson at the Tennessee Arts Commission at the time had put together about the subject for this evening, the fife and drum tradition. They actually had Willie Hurt, members of the Hurt family, and R.L. Boyce, who had knowledge of and deep roots in the fife and drum tradition in North Mississippi, up to Brownsville, doing an apprenticeship there with a young woman named Keisha Burton. And so met John there that day, saw John that day, and he came up and spoke about the subject for this evening, and he was neck deep in the research at the time, and I knew then that we'd be seeing and hearing a lot more from John Shaw, and he obliged us, thankfully, with a book on the subject, which I think is in links in the chat feature, and will be on the Padlet after the presentation. For the book, I'll say about a word or two more about that in just a minute. And then just this last fall, after the book was completed, I had a chance to see John speak at the Tennessee Folklore Society annual meeting in Nashville, and he did a great presentation there, and look forward to what he has to say this evening. So I'm going to introduce him now. John M. Shaw is an ethnomusicologist, music researcher, writer, blogger, musician, and composer. He's a 2020 graduate of the University of Memphis, where he earned a master's of music and musicology. He's currently a graduate assistant and doctoral student at the same institution. His academic emphases are in the musics of the African diaspora, and the impact of African-American music on the concert music tradition. He's author of Following the Drums, African-American Fife and Drum Music in Tennessee, the book I just showed you, which was published by University Press of Mississippi in 2022. He's currently at work on a second book, Actions Speak Louder Than Words, African-American Music and the Recording Industry in Shreveport, 1948 to 1998. And I'm happy to welcome John, and I'm going to turn the program over to him now.
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate it, Dr. Pitts. Appreciate you, Dr. Wilkins. Very supportive of what I've been trying to do. This work started in an interesting way because, of course, the fife and drum music is associated in most people's minds with North Mississippi. And that's primarily because it has survived in North Mississippi. But I was curious as to why we don't know more about Fayette County, Tennessee, which is a county that demographically and geographically resembles Marshall County, Mississippi, which it adjoins. Marshall is a hotbed of blues and has a lot of famous people. So the question in my mind was, why do we not have the same level of awareness and musical knowledge about Fayette County? And in doing Googling and research, I said, I wonder if they had fife and drum bands like Holly Springs did. And I Googled it and got a result I wasn't expecting. It said the United Sons and Daughters of Zion number 9 fife and drum band, Bartlett, Tennessee, while I live in Bartlett. So I was fascinated. I'm like, there was a fife and drum band in Bartlett? And the reference was not just to that band, but to a compact disc. So apparently this had been released on a record, which was even more fascinating. And as I delved into it, I found out that a man named Ben Olson had been in Bartlett and had been in Fayette County and had made field recordings in the early 70s, and that the leader of this fife and drum band was Lum Guffin from Bartlett, whose grandson I graduated from high school with. So this led me to this work, to this research, to dig up the history of Black fife and drum music in West Tennessee, particularly, rather than Mississippi. And to my astonishment, there's a newspaper record of this music going all the way back to before Reconstruction. And this was what I found to be amazing, that we had references to Black drummers in the 1850s in Memphis during fire brigade parades, at political rallies in 1860 in Clarksville, Tennessee, in Confederate home guards during the Civil War, obviously in Union troops as well, and that many of these Black drummers are mentioned by name. Jordan Noble Banks at the Battle of Chalmette in New Orleans with Andrew Jackson, and was later asked to play at Andrew Jackson's funeral. And any number of, some of these drummers were in state militias, and they were almost famous and known by their names. In Georgia, before the Civil War, I found an obituary of Old Bob, who was said to be 107, a Black drummer, and was said to have played at the Battle of Brandywine during the Revolutionary War. So the fact is, we can link this fife and drum tradition to the use of Black drummers in the militias and armies even before emancipation, which I wouldn't have believed if I didn't see it in print. But there's absolutely no doubt about it. And there were Black drummers on both sides of the Civil War. When the war was over, this music becomes associated with the freedmen in particular, and becomes an extremely politicized form of music, as it was employed by the Republican Party and the loyal leagues to herd people to the polls and to fire up enthusiasm for their political candidates. During the times, which varied, but during the times that the Democrats wanted to recruit Black voters, they employed Black fife and drum bands as well. And so this was one of the major impetuses for this type of music to spread. But it was also associated with the burial societies. The Black community did not have life insurance. For the most part, before the Civil War, no Southerners had life insurance. And the first life insurance companies were basically being formed during Reconstruction. Jefferson Davis was living in Memphis and running one of them, the Southern Life Insurance Company. But these new companies would not write policies for Black people. So basically, they formed benevolent and burial societies that were associated with the cemeteries, associated in some cases with various churches, and these societies would run the cemeteries and would own them. But they didn't take in enough money from dues. A man would join, but they didn't take in enough money from dues to maintain these facilities. So they would also hold elaborate picnics that sometimes would run 2 or 3 days and run all night long. And the entertainment for these picnics was also provided by these fife and drum bands. So what exactly are these bands like? Well, the fife was generally made out of cane, out of bamboo cane. There are some accounts in other states like Louisiana of it being made out of sugar cane, but for the most part, these were made out of bamboo. Holes were burnt into them. They were hollowed out, and a hole for blowing was burned on one side and holes for the 5 fingers on the other. Willie Hurt demonstrated how these bamboo fifes were made at Brownsville at the workshop that Dr. Pitts mentioned. There are plenty of accounts during Reconstruction and after at which, when public performances were held of these bands with the bamboo fifes, that occasionally the fife player would be donated or given a metal fife or a wooden fife often by white people. Very interesting. Lum Guffin had a rosewood fife in his possession that had belonged to his dad. So this you hear this over and over. I think even Otha Turner in Mississippi said he was given a metal fife by a white man. So this sometimes took place. Then you had the drums, which were generally military drums. The snare was for some reason often called a kettle by country African Americans, and the bass drum was usually just called the drum or the big drum. It was not uncommon to hear these bands referred to as a drum and fife band rather than a fife and drum band, or even just the drums. One woman, I believe Lynette Wooten, said to me, "I used to follow the drums, but I've gotten too old for that now." So the drums or the fife and drum band, almost never was it called a fife and drum corps. Occasionally it was called a field band. And as early as 1874, the music stores had caught on to this and the importance of it in politics. And so I'll put an ad up here: for sale, drums and fifes, $25 a set, consisting of 1 bass, 1 tenor, 1 fife, all calf heads and sticks, complete. Send in your orders. And this was E.A. Benson Music Company in Memphis, 317 Main Street. And there are plenty of accounts of various parades, one for the death of Charles Sumner, who was considered a hero, the senator who was a hero to Black Memphians because he stood for racial equality. And they had a huge parade in his honor when he died, and all the societies turned out with their banners and with the fife and drum. So this was not uncommon during the time of Reconstruction. As late as 1884, a Jackson, Tennessee paper publishes a similar ad. Notice it says drums and fifes for campaign cheap. It was election season. And even this was even as if Reconstruction was fading, but still, with political campaigns about, people were looking to buy fifes and drums for their campaigns to get out people to their rallies. So this was very, very common during that period of time. But this becomes controversial. White people don't like it. There's all kinds of complaints. One is it's military music, so they question whether Black people are planning an insurrection? Are they planning to rise up against the white community and go to war? Another is it's making an infernal noise. We can't sleep. It's keeping us awake. And perhaps the most common, it's frightening horses and teams. And that was perhaps the most valid one, because I did find many accounts where the fife and drum bands in cities, particularly Nashville, frightened a team of horses, which ran away with the carriage, and in some cases ended in tragedy with somebody getting killed or somebody getting hurt, because once they took off at a run, runaway horses, you couldn't always get them stopped, particularly if the driver was a woman. And so cities began passing ordinances against the fife and drum, which might explain why it eventually becomes something we associate with rural areas and only with rural areas. So I think this is, but there's plenty of documentation of these bands during the 1870s. The people that ran them often had a brass band as well as the fife and drum, and in some cases they had a field. They called the fife and drum a field band, and then they also may have had a string band. All three were popular at the time. The brass bands tended to be in cities, and the fife and drum bands tended to be used more in the rural areas. But this begins to disappear, at least from the newspapers. By the 1890s, you're not seeing any more references to this, with the exception of Nashville. And it stays on in Nashville much longer than just about any place else as far as being able to read about it in the papers. I think it was going on in the rural counties straight through the 40s, 50s, and 60s until its rediscovery, but the newspapers quit commenting on it. When things became segregated and when the right to vote had largely been taken away from the Black community, these political rallies no longer took place. And white people were no longer going to these Black picnics or festivities. Those who went during Reconstruction were frowned upon. Those politicians that would go to a Black picnic and ask for votes were demonized in the local newspapers. And I've got plenty of those articles as pandering to the Black vote. And by the 1890s, no politician in the South would have done that. There was a opprobrium put on even being a Republican if you were white. So basically, everything became segregated. So the newspapers only mentioned these picnics and events if somebody got cut or shot or hurt. And if the lawmen had to come break it up. And other than that, there's no mention of any music at them. There's no mention of what was going on. They just said that a cutting scrape developed at a picnic near Humboldt, and the sheriff had to go make arrests and break it up. So, that's the kind of thing you read after 1890. But in Nashville, they had started using fife and drum for advertising. And I don't read about that anywhere else, but businesses would use it to drum up business, no pun intended. And the baseball franchise, the Volunteers, used it to tell people that a game was taking place. They hired a particular Black fife and drum band to do this that became known as the Baseball Fife and Drum. It had a name, the Spirits of 1876, but rarely did the newspapers call it that. And more often, they either called it the Senegambian Fife and Drum Band or the Ethiopian Fife and Drum Band on one occasion. And on other occasions, Rippididi's Band, which is a name that probably meant something to the sports page readers of that era, the 1920s, but is not something I can decipher. but we know a lot about this band, and there's plenty of accounts of them. They were used by the minor league baseball at Sulphurdale Park in Nashville well up until the late 20s. They seem to have been dismissed from the franchise about 1927 or 28. They had also been hired by the Rotarians to go to the National Rotary Convention in Atlanta, which they did. And they were hired by the League of Women's Suffrage in 1916 in Nashville, which was a group of white women to play at their protest rally in front of the state capitol, which I find a very provocative maneuver indeed, and amazing. But they were hired to do that. They said the article said they hired the fife and drum band, well known from the baseball games, to play at the rally. So this band was apparently led by a man named Yeatman Milan, who was also a theater orchestra musician. He played for the largest Black theater in Nashville, which I believe was called the Bijou, and lived a fairly tragic life. His wife was murdered by a madam, a woman that ran a house of prostitution, and for some reason, in some sort of an argument, this woman killed his wife, who was pregnant with his child at the time, and the incident made the Nashville papers. But Yeatman Milam ran this band and was also the employee of a fruit market. And when there was rumors that the Nashville baseball team was going to fire this band during the mid-20s, the sports editor at the time of the Tennessean said, it's not baseball without the fife and drum. Save them. And Yeatman Milan wrote a letter saying, we desire to continue. So I think it was very interesting, and they ultimately do for another few years. But he dies in 1947, and his obituary does not even mention his role in the fife and drum band that played for baseball. A year or two after that, another member is mentioned in that he was the last living member of this band, and he dies. So it survived a little bit longer in the public eye in Nashville, but I don't think it ever really went away in Lauderdale, Haywood, Tipton, rural Shelby, and Fayette. It was just not going to be mentioned in the white weekly papers of these counties, and there were no Black papers outside of Memphis. And in Memphis, when you look at the Black newspapers, the Tri-State Defender and the World, they were interested in an upwardly mobile, wealthy, middle to upper class Black community that would have seen this fife and drum music as something rural, something uncouth, something beneath the dignity of well-educated, well-mannered, endowed, financially, upwardly mobile Black community to which those papers were aimed. And so they don't ever mention fife and drum. The Nashville Globe never mentions fife and drum. It's quite bizarre as you look at these papers. In some cases, they do mention in the various small town columns the societies for which the fife and drum bands were hired, which is interesting. They'll mention the Independent Pole Bearers. They'll mention the Social Benevolence Society. They'll mention the United Sons and Daughters of Zion. But even as they mention that these organizations held a meeting, they don't mention the musicians or the drummers or the fifers. So it's, you could read the extant Black newspapers of the state and never know that this was going on, because it was, something that they either did not want to promote or something that was beyond the experience of the people running them. And that seems to have been the case. So how does it come back? How do we know that it never went away? And the answer is that in the late 1940s, there's a folk revival. We come to a point at which, in the wake of World War II, there's this emphasis on folk song. This, and I mean, it probably was going on before during the 30s. Carl Sandburg publishes his American Song Bag. Certainly those that leaned left or even Marxist were very interested in folk song for obvious reasons. The Almanac Singers, Abe Murrapall was interested in folk song, the man who wrote Strange Fruit for Billie Holiday. So you've got this beginnings of a proletarian folk kind of movement, and it eventually leads to people going south looking for this culture, these folk cultures. Obviously, the pioneers of it before the World War II were John Lomax and his son Alan, and they were already doing this kind of work, you know, with cutting lathes down in Louisiana and Texas and Mississippi and elsewhere. But in the late 40s, it really picks up. Alan Lomax discovers a fife and drum band in Quitman County, Mississippi, when he's down there recording blues. This band is actually a band that is from Panola County in Batesville, and is run by Sid Hemphill. You know, some of you may be familiar with Jessie Mae Hemphill, his daughter, but Sid Hemphill runs this band. And later, Alan Lomax says, I found an outcropping of African music in North America of his discovery. But he doesn't write that until 20, 30 years after the discovery was made. But this shows that this music was still out there. It still existed. It was just clandestine. The place where Alan Lomax recorded it, he says, was a picnic grounds called Poor Whore's Kingdom, or it would have been pronounced Po-Ho's Kingdom. That's been disputed. Did he get the facts right? Don't know. But I cite it just to show how obscure the location was, how unlikely he would have been to just discover it by accident. He was looking for blues, and it led him to a place where this was still taking place. In 1959, he discovers another such band led by the Youngs, Ed Young and L.D. Young and G.D. Young, I believe, or all from around Loxahoma in Tate County, Mississippi. So as people start descending on these rural counties, specifically going to Black communities, looking for what they consider to be a lost and dying culture, and that just seems to be a shibboleth of ethnomusicology. Certainly it was in the earliest years. We got to document this stuff because it's dying. It's going away, and if we don't capture it, we're going to lose it. And there's a certain truth to that, you know, because I come as one trying to do this research now that we have lost it, and trying to fragmentarily document something that's no longer extant, which is sad. And they were trying to get it while it was still around. And I think in some ways their activities helped preserve it in the counties where it did hang on, Tate and Panola in Mississippi. But they didn't come here, unfortunately. The Lomaxes, to a large extent, Dr. David Evans, he was active in Como and in Independence, Mississippi, David Evans, and further south. The big time people, George Mitchell, they just didn't come. They came to Memphis, but they didn't really go to Somerville, Brownsville, Lauderdale County. Fortunately, eventually somebody does. Bent Olson. He's from Sweden. And already before him, there were some tentative work in that regard, in the form of Bobby Ray Watson, who somehow discovers Lumguffin, Bill Barth, who was living in Memphis at the time, Robert Palmer. They had formed the Memphis Country Blues Festival in Overton Park. There's a wonderful movie out about that called The Blues Society that Amanda Palmer, Robert's daughter, has been actively involved with. But this created a scene in Memphis that kind of joined people who were interested in blues to the hippie subculture. That's kind of an odd way of putting it, but I don't know of any better way of putting it. So in Memphis, I don't know if this was true elsewhere, but there was this kind of merger of the counterculture interests of the hippie community, which wasn't huge in Memphis. Memphis is a southern city, with the interest of those who want to preserve the blues. And Jim Dickinson was in this subculture, and Bill Barth was in it. Sid Selvage was in it. And so there was this interest in preserving what was here. This led, Steve Levere was involved. This led to the discovery of Joe Willie Wilkins, a rediscovery, I should say. Obviously, Samuel Charter came to Memphis in the late 50s looking for Furry Lewis and did find him, which also, I think, helped lead to the discovery of Memphis Willie Borum. George Mitchell came here and made some wonderful recordings of Will Shade on the album Beale Street Mess Around. So this is all bringing interest, and it's attracting the attention of Europeans. And it causes this European, Bent Olsen, to come from Sweden. And he comes first to Memphis. And if that's all he'd done, he would have done something, because he wrote a wonderful book called Memphis Blues, the first book on its subject. Tiny little tome, but remains one of the few books strictly to talk about the blues from a Memphis standpoint. But then he gets lured into the rurals of Shelby County, and he gets lured into the rural Fayette and Haywood and Tipton, and he's really, in many ways, the only one to do that. He goes to Henning. He lives in Henning for a period of time with a white farmer he's working for, who resents him going out to record black people. The farmer he worked with said, "You're very fortunate to come out alive after having been in a juke joint with a bunch of, racial expletive." I'm not going to say that, but and he records this, but he's got his little tape recorder, and because of that, we've got one track of the United Sons and Daughters of Zion Fife and Drum Band from Bartlett. We have recordings, priceless recordings of Lum Guffin playing the guitar at 2. We have recordings of Laddie Merle from Williston near Somerville, recordings of all these various people. He interviews Jerome Hambone Mans. I don't know if we have that where we can get it, but it exists. So Ben Olsen almost single-handedly opens the door to what we know about Ripley, Henning, Brownsville, Bartlett, Cordova. He was living with Lincoln Jackson in Cordova for a period of time, and Fayette counties with regard to black music. And he was working on a film that never happened about black fife and drum music, in conjunction with Bill Barth and in conjunction with Mark and Judy Mikolas, who were from New York and were involved with Gunter Hoos in the Super 8 Film Company. They shot 5 hours of film footage, taped 15 hours of tape, mostly interviews, and 300 color slides. Unfortunately, all lost. Cannot find any of it. The Mikolas has donated that work product to the Center for Southern Folklore, which claims to have absolutely no awareness of the materials whatsoever. They've moved several times, and they don't know what they hold, and it's very possible that the stuff is still very much within the bowels of the Center for Southern Folklore. But since they don't know where it is and claim to not be familiar with the material at all, I am despairing that we will ever see any of it. Fortunately, Judy Mikolas was desperate for funding to complete the project, which they did not get. But she makes a reel-to-reel tape of excerpts of the recorded music and sends it to Dr. David Evans, thinking that he could possibly help her get funding. David found that in a drawer, thinking it was from Mississippi, told me about it, and because it was written on the box, Fredonia Fife and Drum Band. absolutely amazing, and it proved to be what recordings that were made by this project at Fredonia between Stanton and Mason on the border of Fayette and Haywood counties. Lum Guffin was there, having been brought up there by Ben Olson and Bill Barth. Hallie Manson was playing the bass drum, and I expect that it was I'm forgetting the man's name. His name was Thompson, and he was blowing the fife. And they are talking about the deadbeat. They actually demonstrate the deadbeat, which was a bass drum pattern that was used to signify that someone had died. And when it was played from the picnic grounds, the people who heard it knew that there'd been a death in the society of which they were a member. And the marshals of the society would then go door to door to members and tell them who it was that had passed, because people did not have telephones. And I found this to be a very West African thing to do, to use signals on the bass drum to say, we need to meet as a society, or someone is sick, or someone has died, was a very, very African thing to do. And so in the 60s, there were still these bands. They still existed. The Broadnax Brothers Band in Fayette County, but primarily active around Mason and Tipton County. The Fredonia Band, which was basically operating from a lodge, from a Prince Hall Masonic lodge, and the only such black fife and drum band I've ever encountered that was associated with a Prince Hall lodge and had the Masonic compass on the bass drum, as can be seen in one of the pictures. Let me pull that up here if I can find it. Well, that one doesn't show it. That's an older picture with the men's name. Ben Thompson was the fife player. His name is mentioned there, is written above his head. But let's go here. Yeah, and you can see here that this is the Fredonia Lodge is actually mentioned on the bass drum. This picture seems to be from the late 40s. And there's actually a Masonic compass in the middle of the drum. And this would have been a Prince Hall Lodge in Fredonia. So quite interesting. They were remembered as having played a lot at Douglas School, which was part of the Douglas Works Project Administration demonstration farm community, which still exists outside of Stanton, and gave former sharecroppers and tenant farmers an opportunity to become landowners, which had a tremendous impact on that part of Haywood County. And I interviewed Mr. Thompson's daughter, who was almost approaching 100 years old back in 2017 or so when I did that interview. But this is the Fredonia Band. The Broadnax Brothers, this is what they looked like. That's a rough picture. In fact, it's a picture of a picture. Robert Jeffrey, a folklorist working for the state of Tennessee, took this picture in someone's house, probably Emmanuel Dupree's house, whom he was interviewing in Fayette County about fife and drum activities. And this is the Broadnax Brothers Band. We don't know where the picture was taken. It's probably somewhere in rural Fayette, although it could be rural Tipton. They eventually move away from Fayette County into Tipton County and live out by Highway 14. And there was a third band in the area, that the Longtown Band, of which Homesick James's father was a member. And Pete Lowry took this picture when he was visiting Homesick James's parents. The older man you see sitting in the chair is named Ples Rivers, and he was snare drummer. Ben Olson interviewed him, and there was actually a filmed interview that the Michelises did with him, but that's among the work products that are lost. And so sadly, we don't have that interview with him. But the Longtown Band eventually fails as people leave the rurals and move to the cities, and what's left of it merges with the Fredonia Band. And by the time the Michelises are recording a rump group under the Fredonia name, it really has nothing left of the Ben Thompson, I guess, would have been the connection. But Hallie Manson, the bass drummer, was originally in the Longtown Band. Ples Rivers, the old snare drummer, had been in the Longtown Band. And Bill Barth brings along Lum Guffin, who's not even from that area. He's from Bartlett. And if you listen to the surviving recordings, they struggle to fit in with each other. Their traditions are different. Lum Guffin's is more archaic, and they can't seem to find common ground musically. It's not a bad recording, but it's very interesting. Hallie Manson said Lum's music sounds archaic, like the music of the 1800s. And Lum says that Hallie Manson's music is wild and undisciplined. So it's kind of an interesting idea. Lum's music does indeed, fife and drum wise, does sound very archaic and much more military than the Mississippi tradition of which we're familiar. We have 4 tunes played by them at the University of Washington in 1976 on video, and it's the only video footage we have of a Tennessee fife and drum band. It's at the American Old Time Music Festival and was shot by the ethnomusicologist Robert Garfius. And it's bizarre in a number of ways because they're also dressed in very hot suit coats and dress clothes as they play their drums and fife, which I'm told by Bartlett informants was pretty common for him to do that. But Lum was the most interesting fife and drum band leader because he was also a member of a lodge, not a Masonic lodge, but the United Sons and Daughters of Zion, chapter number 9, which his grandfather had started, Butler Guffin. And this was at Prosperity Church. Lum, this is a picture of the band as they were playing in Seattle, and you can see that they're very dressy. This is not what you usually see from Otha Turner's band or any of the familiar fife and drum bands from Mississippi, and also suggests that this was an older tradition than the one we're familiar with. Notice also how old that snare drum looks, how deep it is. This is almost like something you would have seen used in the Civil War, and I wonder how old the drum is. It looks much older than the bass drum that the other man is playing, and these were John and James Mitchell are playing the drums with him there. This is 1976. Lum is better known to most people as a guitarist, and you see him in front of his house, which the house still stands in Bartlett on Guffin Road. And there he is with his guitar. His only album, he only plays guitar, even though the commentary on the back written by Bill Barth refers to a fife and drum picnic. That's kind of interesting. Bent has a whole chapter on Tennessee fife and drum in his unpublished Memphis Blues revision of 2006. He passed away without completing it, and it has as of yet not been edited or made ready for publication. But there's a whole fife and drum chapter in it, and Bent also found a fife and drum band in the Mount Pisgah community called the Independent Pole Bearers Number 12 Band, and he names names and a tune, which suggests that he heard this band, and it's impossible to me that he didn't record it. Yet it's not extant in what we have, and we have to assume that some of his work product is lost. What exists, David Katz Nelson has, but there's quite a bit that doesn't seem to exist any longer. So this band continues to the mid-70s, probably about 74 or 75. Lum Guffin's band continues. Another band, the Independent Pole Bearers Number 9 band, existed in the Chulahoma Capeville area of Shelby County, and that chapter still exists. They don't have drummers any longer, but this is that band, and this is them playing at their lodge hall, which since has burned. This would have been about 1975. And the use of 2 bass drums here is odd. and suggests that this was a reunion for chapter members and musicians as such, that perhaps it was the last time they were going to do this. And today they have meetings, but they don't have drums. And this is another picture perhaps of the last time they did it. This may be from the early 80s. Their chapter president, Errol Harmon, current chapter president, says that they continued to have fife and drum at their events into about 1985, which would make this one of the last fife and drum bands in Tennessee. But the other last one we can talk about is Ed Harris, who was discovered by Robert Jeffrey. And Robert Jeffrey, we already saw the picture he took of the Broadnax brothers when he was in someone's house in Fayette County. And he took this picture as well. Ed Harris was a relatively young man trying to keep together the remnants of the Broadnax and Fredonia bands after their leaders died. And we only have one recording in which he plays the fife with any drummers. And it is a most chaotic recording made at Chickasaw State Park. The drummers keep falling out of phase with each other, which disrupts the tune. And the rest of the recordings that the state of Tennessee made are only of the fife without drums. So, and he says in the interview that exists that it's hard to get drummers, which is something that the guys were mentioning in the recording that Musicologist made in '73, that it was becoming difficult to find drummers. And by 1980, when Robert Jeffrey made the recording, that this was all the more the case. So what basically happened? Why did this become so? Why was this happening? And my answer is proximity to Memphis. The access to electricity. Even in Bartlett, they said the picnics became less interesting when they had electricity because they started hiring a DJ instead of a band. And the kids had access to WDIA and WLOK. So they're hearing Otis Redding, they're hearing James Brown, they're hearing bands. You know, eventually it's the OJ's, Earth, Wind and Fire. This rural beating drums and blowing a fife, that's something old people did, and perhaps was even looked down upon by young people as some kind of legacy of the fields, of the cotton fields, of slave times and sharecropper times, and something that's bad memory. We don't want to encourage that, you know. And another factor is that the president of Independent Pole Bearers number 6 in Ellendale, Brunswick, said we had to quit doing our picnic because people were showing up to it drunk, and people were showing up to it high on pills, high on some kind of drug, and they would get to fighting or worse. And he said we would be responsible. We own the land. So if people got injured or got shot or something happened on our property, they could sue, or their loved ones could sue us. So we reluctantly just quit doing the picnics. And he said that happened about 1978. So and the other thing that happened, and I'll close with this, life insurance happened. And you say, what does that have to do with music? Well, a lot, because the music came from the societies, the burial society, benevolent societies. Being a member of a society was a lot of work. As a young man, you would be asked to help dig the graves. And as an older man, you might be asked to be a treasurer, secretary, vice president. All those had duties. And, you know, life insurance, once there were black life insurance companies, Universal Life Insurance, Georgia Life Insurance, you just paid your premium and you were covered, you know. There wasn't all the extra duty that came with being a member of the society. So people quit joining the societies, especially in the 60s and early 70s. And while the Chapter 9 Independent Pole Bearers in Shelby County says they have 300 members still, Chapter 6, I think, is down in Brunswick, is down to about 8 or 9 elderly women and maybe one man who's the president. So, you know, this is they quit, you know, without membership, they can't hire the bands. They didn't have the money to hire the bands. In Mississippi, the bands took on a separate existence that was no longer tied to the societies. And that's how they survived. But in Tennessee, that doesn't seem to have ever happened. So as people shifted from joining the society to buying life insurance, the picnics begin to fade away, and the bands don't have anybody hiring them anymore, so they begin to fade away too. And that seems to be what ultimately happened. And that happened in Mississippi too. I mean, we're down to the point where there maybe are 2 fife and drum bands that exist in the United States, black. And one of them is Sharday Thomas running her grandfather's Rising Star fife and drum band, and the other is the Hurt family, who appears only sporadically, particularly since Willie Hurt has moved to Dallas. And they don't publicize when they do get together. It's largely for the family. And, those who are in the know can show up if they want to, but it's not publicized, and it certainly is not something they're doing, as a performance per se. So that's where we are at this point. And I guess I don't know what the next step is in this seminar, but that concludes what I'm prepared to say.